Guilt is perhaps the most useless emotion in the human repertoire, yet we cling to it as if our moral survival depends on it. The American obsession with guilt, this peculiar idea that we must mentally flagellate ourselves to prove our goodness, is quite possibly one of the greatest cons ever perpetrated on the human psyche. Like a tree that's been struck by lightning, we stand damaged yet alive, convinced that the charred parts of ourselves are deserved punishment, rather than simply the result of life's wild and unpredictable storm. We wear our guilt like a badge of honor in this culture, as if feeling terrible about ourselves somehow proves we're on the path to becoming better. But have you ever watched a river after a storm? It doesn't punish itself for flooding. It doesn't agonize over the banks it has overrun. It simply returns to its natural course, carrying away the debris, nourishing the land with new sediment. Nature knows no guilt, only movement, adjustment, and continuation. Why do we believe our mistakes require endless mental punishment? What strange arithmetic have we invented where suffering must equal the weight of our transgressions? The corporate American mindset has trained us to see ourselves as productivity machines, where errors represent system failures requiring correction through punishment. We've internalized the language of performance reviews into our moral lives, documenting our deficiencies, setting improvement goals, measuring our worth through endless self-evaluation. We carry spreadsheets of guilt in our minds, columns of debits that we believe must be paid through emotional suffering. The suburban American experience compounds this further. Behind manicured lawns and coordinated furniture sets lies the constant anxiety of comparison. We feel guilty for not measuring up to the Jones family next door, for not volunteering enough at school functions, for ordering takeout instead of preparing an Instagram-worthy home-cooked meal. These seemingly trivial guilts accumulate like credit card debt, small charges that compound into overwhelming spiritual bankruptcy. What if I told you that this entire edifice of guilt is a magnificent illusion? What if forgiveness, true forgiveness, has nothing to do with the elaborate moral accounting we've been taught to perform? The strangest paradox about guilt is that it poses as a solution to the very problem it perpetuates. We believe feeling guilty proves we care, that our suffering somehow balances our moral ledger. Yet guilt keeps us locked in the past, replaying old scripts, preventing the very growth it supposedly promotes. It's like trying to drive forward while staring exclusively in the rearview mirror. Eventually, you'll crash into something new. This guilt-forgiveness equation we've created is a closed loop, a hamster wheel of suffering that never actually leads anywhere. The secret of forgiveness isn't found within this system, it requires stepping outside it entirely. Before we explore what forgiveness actually is, we must first understand what it isn't. It isn't the end result of sufficient guilt. It isn't earned through psychological self-punishment. It isn't something that occurs after you've proven your remorse through adequate suffering. If you're waiting to feel you've suffered enough before allowing forgiveness, you'll be waiting your entire life. The path beyond guilt begins with questioning its very utility. What if guilt itself is the barrier to the transformation you seek? What if forgiveness is not the reward for feeling sufficiently terrible, but the doorway that only opens when you stop believing in the necessity of your guilt? Have you ever noticed how your moments of genuine growth rarely come from periods of intense self-recrimination? Have they perhaps come instead in moments of honest acceptance, when you finally stopped fighting against yourself? Comment below. Have you ever felt trapped in a cycle of guilt that seemed impossible to break free from? What did that experience teach you about forgiveness? Let's explore how we've become so entangled in this peculiar relationship with guilt, particularly in American society. Like a mighty oak that appears solid and permanent, our guilt doesn't simply exist. It grew from specific seeds in particular soil under certain conditions. The American preoccupation with guilt has deep historical roots in the Puritan ethic that helped shape the nation's character. Those early settlers brought with them a theology where constant moral vigilance was required, and where the natural human state was one of sinfulness requiring correction.
This religious foundation seeped into our cultural groundwater, creating a society where productivity became morality, where worth must be continually proven through effort and achievement. Even as formal religious adherence has decreased, this moral framework remains, like an abandoned house whose foundation still shapes the landscape. The ocean of American culture has particular currents that keep guilt circulating through our collective consciousness. Consider how we speak of forgiveness in our everyday language. It must be earned, deserved, worked for. We treat moral redemption like the American dream itself, something that must be strived for, achieved through hard work and determination. Pulling yourself up by your bootstraps applies as much to moral rehabilitation as to economic advancement. But have you noticed how this framework creates an endless cycle? The harder you try to overcome guilt through effort, the more entangled you become in its logic. It's like trying to extinguish a fire by feeding it more wood. Close your eyes for a moment and feel how guilt manifests in your body. Perhaps a heaviness in your chest, a tightness in your throat, a churning in your stomach. This physical experience isn't abstract. It's how your organism responds to the belief that you must suffer to become whole again. Your body becomes the battleground where this cultural programming plays out. Our educational system reinforces this relationship with guilt from our earliest years. Remember the shame of being caught passing notes in class, or the sting of the red pen marking wrong answers? We learned that mistakes equal personal failure, that imperfection warrants correction through discomfort. This conditioning continues through college admissions pressure, where teenagers internalize the message that their worth depends on achievement, that failure reflects character deficiency rather than normal human learning. In professional life, American workplace culture often operates on subtle currencies of guilt and shame. The expectation to answer emails at midnight, to sacrifice family time for project deadlines, to present perpetual enthusiasm regardless of circumstances. These demands create a backdrop of constant inadequacy. Sunday scaries aren't just about returning to work, they're about returning to a system where you never quite measure up. Even our entertainment reinforces this relationship with guilt. Hollywood redemption narratives nearly always require the protagonist to suffer sufficiently before earning forgiveness. Our heroes must hit rock bottom, experience maximum pain, before the possibility of redemption appears. We've internalized these storytelling patterns as moral truths. The peculiar American relationship to guilt also manifests in our approach to health and wellness. The no pain, no gain mentality extends beyond the gym into our psychological lives. We believe transformation must hurt, that growth requires suffering. Diet culture perfectly exemplifies this, the language of cheating on your diet, of being good by restricting calories, creates moral categories from simple biological functions. What if this entire framework is backward? What if guilt isn't the necessary precondition for growth, but the very obstacle preventing it? Tell me in the comments, when did you first realize that feeling guilty about something wasn't actually helping you change or grow? What situation showed you the limitations of guilt as a motivator? Now we arrive at the revelation that Alan Watts offered about forgiveness, a perspective that liberates us from the hamster wheel of guilt and self-punishment we've been running on for so long. True forgiveness, in the Wattsian sense, isn't something you earn through sufficient suffering. Rather, it's the recognition that the separate self you've been punishing is itself an illusion. Like waves in the ocean mistakenly believing they are separate from the water, we imagine ourselves as isolated entities whose mistakes must be corrected through punishment. But the wave and the ocean are one reality appearing in different forms. Consider how a forest responds to a wildfire. It doesn't engage in self-recrimination about what went wrong. There is no committee of trees assigning blame or demanding penance. Instead, new growth emerges naturally from the blackened earth. Certain seeds even require the intense heat of fire to germinate. What we perceive as destruction is simply transformation taking a form we hadn't anticipated. This is the essence of Wu Wei, effortless action applied to forgiveness. not a strained psychological effort to feel differently about your past, but the natural falling away of guilt when you recognize its fundamental irrelevance to healing and growth. The American fixation on processing guilt often resembles someone stirring a pond to clear the mud, not realizing that stirring only keeps the water cloudy. True clarity comes not from processing, but from allowing the mud to settle naturally. When mental activity around guilt subsides, the clarity of forgiveness appears of its own accord. Think of forgiveness as similar to the relationship between the sky and clouds. The sky never needs to forgive the clouds for existing. It simply contains them, allows them to form, shift, and dissolve. Your consciousness is like this sky, vast enough to hold all experiences without being defined by any of them. Guilt is merely a passing cloud formation, not the sky itself. Take a moment now to simply observe your breath. Notice how each inhale naturally gives way to an exhale without effort or intervention. This rhythm continues whether you're consciously aware of it or not. Forgiveness has this same quality of naturalness when we stop interfering with it through our elaborate moral accounting systems. The presence that Watts spoke of, being fully here and now, reveals something remarkable about guilt. Guilt exists only in relation to past and future, never in the present moment itself. It requires a story about what happened before and what should happen next. In pure presence, guilt cannot find a foothold. Like trying to grab a handful of river water, it slips through your fingers the moment you become fully present. This is why meditation practices can be so transformative in releasing guilt, not because they help you process anything, but because they temporarily suspend the narrative in which guilt makes sense. In moments of pure awareness, the entire framework of guilt appears as an unnecessary complication. The Buddha nature that Watts often referenced points to our already perfect essence beneath the psychological drama. Like the sun that never stops shining even when clouds obscure it from view, this fundamental wholeness remains untouched by our perceived moral failings. Forgiveness isn't something you achieve, it's the recognition of what was never actually damaged. This perspective radically challenges the American self-improvement industrial complex, which profits from our perpetual sense of inadequacy. In a culture where even spirituality has been commodified into 10 steps to inner peace, the simplicity of Watts' message is revolutionary. There's nothing to improve, nothing to fix, only the illusion of separation to see through. The flowering of forgiveness happens naturally when we stop overwatering the soil with guilt. Like a lotus that rises untouched through muddy water, our fundamental wholeness emerges not through effort, but through allowing. Share with us, have you had an awakening moment about forgiveness, where you realized it wasn't something you needed to earn or achieve? What shifted in your understanding? Returning to our original exploration of forgiveness and its power to free us from guilt, we can now integrate these insights into daily life. The secret of forgiveness isn't a technique or practice, it's a fundamental shift in perspective that transforms our relationship with our own humanity. When we recognize guilt as an unnecessary addition to experience rather than a moral requirement, our approach to mistakes changes entirely. Like the sky that allows clouds of all types to pass through it without resistance or attachment, we can learn to hold our missteps in a more spacious awareness. This doesn't mean becoming irresponsible or careless, quite the opposite. When we're no longer expending energy on self-punishment, we have more resources available for genuine growth and consideration of others. In American work culture, where hustle and grinding have become virtuous by default, this perspective offers revolutionary relief. The next time you miss a deadline or make an error in a presentation, notice the automatic guilt response. Rather than feeding it with elaborate stories about your inadequacy, simply acknowledge the mistake and move toward correction. The productivity gained from skipping the guilt spiral is remarkable. Energy previously consumed by self-recrimination becomes available for creative solutions. The same applies to relationships, where the Instagram versus reality gap often triggers waves of shame about not living up to idealized standards. When you forget an anniversary, say something hurtful in an argument, or fail to be present with your children after a long workday, the guilt response only compounds the original issue. True repair happens not through psychological self-flagellation, but through honest acknowledgement and changed behavior. Watts might suggest that forgiveness is like the natural healing of a wound. The body knows exactly how to close a cut without needing instructions or moral justification. Similarly, our psyche has an intrinsic healing capacity that functions best when we don't interfere with elaborate guilt narratives. This doesn't mean ignoring responsibility. It means responding to it cleanly. This perspective liberates us from the particularly American trap of earning worthiness through perpetual self-improvement. The pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality has infiltrated our moral understanding, creating the illusion that forgiveness, like success, must be achieved through effort and determination. What if worthiness isn't earned but recognized as your natural state? Hope emerges not from the promise of becoming better through sufficient effort, but from accepting that wholeness is your starting point rather than your destination. This is perhaps the most radical aspect of Watts' teaching, that acceptance precedes change rather than following it. When we accept ourselves completely, including our capacity for mistakes and harm, we paradoxically become more capable of growth than when driven by guilt's whip. Consider how this understanding might transform your relationship with everyday experiences of guilt. The Sunday night anxiety about the coming work week, the parental guilt about not being present enough, the social media-induced FOMO, the comparison with colleagues who seem to have it all figured out, all these familiar American experiences look different when viewed through this lens. The synthesis of Watts' perspective brings us full circle to our opening paradox. Forgiveness isn't the end result of sufficient guilt, but its antidote. Like the flame that doesn't need to apologize for burning, or the river for flowing, your essential nature remains intact, regardless of the forms your life temporarily takes. This doesn't mean abandoning ethics or responsibility. It means fulfilling them from a place of wholeness rather than fragmentation. The most profound ethical actions come not from fear of punishment or guilt, but from the recognition of our fundamental interconnection. When I truly see that harming you is harming myself, not as a philosophical concept, but as lived reality, ethical behavior flows naturally. Which insight about forgiveness and guilt resonated most deeply with you? Was it the recognition that guilt often prevents the very growth it claims to promote? The understanding that forgiveness isn't earned through suffering, but recognized as your natural state? Or perhaps the practical relief of responding to mistakes without the additional burden of self-punishment? Drop a comment below and share your experience.